Jean Baudrillard. Disneyland, the Hyperreal and the Imaginary, from Simulacra and Simulation. The Hyperreal and the Imaginary. Disneyland is a perfect model of all the entangled orders of simulacra. It is first a play of illusions and phantasms, the pirates, the frontier, the future world, etc. This imaginary world is supposed to ensure the success of the operation, but what attracts the crowds the most is without a doubt the social microcosm, the religious, miniaturized pleasure of real America, of its constraints and joys. One parks outside and stands in line inside. One is altogether abandoned at the exit. The only phantasmagoria in this imaginary world lies in the tenderness and warmth of the crowd, and in the sufficient and excessive number of gadgets necessary to create the multitudinous effect. The contrast with the absolute solitude of the parking lot, a veritable concentration camp, is total. Or rather, inside, a whole panoply of gadgets magnetizes the crowd in directed flows. Outside, solitude is directed at a single gadget, the automobile. Thus, everywhere in Disneyland, the objective profile of America, down to the morphology of individuals and of the crowd, is drawn. All its values are exalted by the miniature and the comic strip, embalmed and pacified. Whence the possibility of an ideological analysis of Disneyland, digest of the American way of life, panegyric of American values, idealized transposition of a contradictory reality. But this masks something else, and this ideological blanket functions as a cover for a simulation of the third order. Disneyland exists in order to hide that it is the real country, all of real America that is Disneyland. A bit like prisons are there to hide that it is the social in its entirety, in its banal omnipresence, that is carceral. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, whereas all of Los Angeles and the America that surrounds it are no longer real, but belong to the hyperreal order and to the order of simulation. It is no longer a question of a false representation of reality, but of concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus of saving the reality principle. The imaginary of Disneyland is neither true nor false. It is a deterrence machine set up in order to rejuvenate the fiction of the real in the opposite camp. Whence the debility of this imaginary, its infantile degeneration. The world wants to be childish in order to make us believe that the adults are elsewhere in the real world, and to conceal the fact that true childishness is everywhere, that it is that of the adults themselves who come here to act the child in order to foster illusions as to their real childishness. Disneyland, a space of the regeneration of the imaginary as waste treatment plants are elsewhere and even here. Elsewhere today, one must recycle waste, and the dreams, the phantasms, the historical, fairy-like, legendary, imaginary of children and adults is a waste product, the first great toxic excrement of a hyperreal civilization. On a mental level, Disneyland is the prototype of this new function, but all the sexual, psychic, somatic, recycling institutes which proliferate in California belong to the same order. People no longer look at each other, but there are institutes for that. They no longer touch each other, but there is contactotherapy. They no longer walk, but they go jogging, etc. Everywhere, One recycles lost faculties, or lost bodies, or lost sociality, or the lost taste for food. One reinvents penury, asceticism, vanished savage naturalness, natural food, health food, yoga. Marshall Sahlins' idea that it is the economy of the market and not of nature at all that secretes penury is verified, but at a secondary level. Here, in the sophisticated confines of a triumphal market economy, is reinvented a penury sign, a penury simulacrum, a simulated behavior of the underdeveloped, that in the guise of ecology, of energy crises, and the critique of capital, adds a final esoteric areola to the triumph of an esoteric culture. Nevertheless, maybe a mental catastrophe, a mental implosion and involution without precedent lies in wait for a system of this kind, whose visible signs would be those of this strange obesity, or the incredible coexistence of the most bizarre theories and practices which correspond to the improbable coalition of luxury, heaven, and money, to the improbable luxurious materialization of life, and to undiscoverable contradictions.